Yeah. But you're also an attorney. So how did you end up becoming? How did you manage studying law, but
Yeah.
also playing professional ball?
Yeah, so I went to a small Division III school in Massachusetts, Williams College. Good academics, good athletics was a good fit for me, and studied political science and English. And when I went and my first year in the minor leagues in 2012 with the Diamondbacks, I made $3,300 for the entire year. And I thought it was a joke at the time. I was like, wait, I remember literally asking one of my teammates who had been with the Diamondbacks for a couple of years, like, where's the rest of the paycheck? Literally, like, I don't, I'm confused, right? And he kind of laughed. He was like, yeah, man, this is what it is, how it's always been, how it's always going to be. And that was kind of the mindset at the time.
Okay, guys, welcome back. We have a really, really exciting conversation today. I always say that, but this time I really, really mean it. Someone who I have a lot of admiration for, I'm happy to call a friend of mine that you may have seen in the news. Someone that has had a huge impact on not only minor league baseball, but sports in general. Someone who I had the pleasure of connecting with that I reached out to recently because there's some really weird stuff happening in the baseball world and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But first, I want to just introduce Harry Marino, president of Sports Solidarity. Welcome, Harry.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry. Happy to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for joining on such short notice. We haven't put one of these up in a few weeks, but we were sort of waiting for the right conversation piece. So I think what we're going to talk about today is going to interest a lot of folks. So first of all, before we dive into the crazy stuff happening in baseball, football, all the things going on, tell us a little bit about you. Most folks might not know how you actually started in sports. So tell folks about your early career.
Yeah, so hard to believe now, but I once upon a time was a professional athlete myself. I was a pitcher in the minor league system for the Arizona Diamondbacks and the Baltimore Orioles for a few seasons back in 2012, 13, and 14. Um, and in many ways, that was, a dream come true, right? As anyone who kind of grows up playing little league, high school, college ball, to play professionally was always kind of the dream. I got to play alongside many, future major leaguers, some stars. Um, but, I'm sure we'll talk about here, my kind of life's work came out of being taken pretty much right away by the inequity of the system when I got into minor league baseball. So I got my start on the playing side. Certainly, loved the game, loved playing, but um, like I said, pretty much out of the gate once I started playing, was taken by some of the unexpected side of professional baseball and the inequities of the system, and that led me down a totally different path that has me far away from being on the pitcher's mound as I sit here today.
So that's really, really interesting. And let's start somewhere that I haven't even personally asked you this. What was it like being a kid? Because you've seen my baseball card as a kid.
I have, I
I was
have.
like, like 100 pounds soaking wet. But like, did you know that, or did your family know that you were better than average? I mean, everybody has a dream to play baseball, basketball, football, something like that. But like, was it like, man, Harry's like really good? At what age did people notice that you were somewhat different?
Yeah, I was a late bloomer, honestly. Like I always loved playing. I was obsessed with sports, baseball, basketball, especially growing up. But I really, like I was on the good travel teams and stuff, but I wasn't the best player in my town or the best player really until really it was kind of college that I ended up really taking the leap. So pretty late, right? I mean, I played in high school. I My senior year of high school, I really had a good season, but I was a small kid, kind of grew late, and I was a pitcher, so I ended up adding a lot of, velocity to my fastball kind of late in high school and then into college. And as you can appreciate, that kind of changes your trajectory as a pitcher. And so that was kind of a benefit for me because I wasn't somebody who, so many of the players that I played with in the minor leagues from the time they were 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, like that was it. Like they were going to be a professional baseball player. But for me, I was focused on school. Like I loved sports, but I didn't think of myself it wasn't even, it was a dream in the abstract, like I'm sure you had or anybody had, of like, hey, maybe I could do this one day, but it wasn't something I was like actively working toward until I got into college. And once I could, throw 90 miles an hour and that kind of stuff, I was like, remember talking to some of my college teammates and they're like, hey, you actually got a chance to get drafted here. And that was probably, my sophomore year of college before that was even something that was a reality. So it was late.
I love how you just casually said once I could pitch 90 miles an hour. That's like
Uh, well,
insane. I
today,
mean,
today that's nothing. Like 10, 15
mm,
years ago,
right,
um,
right.
that was good. But yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's
For
funny.
those of us not in baseball, still impressive. So, but you're also an attorney. So, how did you end up becoming? How did you manage studying law, but
Yeah.
also playing professional ball?
Yeah, so I went to a small Division III school in Massachusetts, Williams College. Good academics, good athletics was a good fit for me, and studied political science and English. And when I went and my first year in the minor leagues in 2012 with the Diamondbacks, I made $3,300 for the entire year. And I thought it was a joke at the time. I was like, wait, I remember literally asking one of my teammates who had been with the Diamondbacks for a couple of years, like, where's the rest of the paycheck? Literally, like, I don't, I'm confused, right? And he kind of laughed. He was like, yeah, man, this is what it is, how it's always been, how it's always going to be. And that was kind of the mindset at the time. Um, and so obviously we can circle back to how that kind of has informed my work more recently. At the time, it made me realize like I need a backup plan because I need to, get a job in the off season, but I also, I can only do this for so long. I can only, I was fortunate I could ask my parents for a little support. I could go work jobs in the off season. I could try to figure it out. But I knew, at that kind of pay, it was going to either be you can make it to the major leagues and that's a viable career, or you got to be thinking about what's next sooner than later. And so that first off season, um, in between, the 2012 and 2013 minor league seasons, I studied for the LSAT, and then between the 2013 and 14 minor league seasons, I applied to law school because I was kind of thinking this isn't a sustainable career, and I have to be kind of thinking about the next step. So once I got released by the Orioles in 2014, um, I had already kind of started that process, and so I ended up going to University of Virginia for law school. Literally started like a week after my last minor league game.
I think that's extremely impressive, making the best out of a really tough situation. Uh, as someone who also unionized their workplace, I really relate to what you said about someone sort of telling you this is the way that it is, this is the way it's always going to be. They just kind of can't see any different reality. So before we jump into the specific conditions within the minor league, what made you want to form a union within the minor leaguers? Like, what made you even know it was possible?
Yeah, so it's so funny. I don't think when I played in 2012, 13, 14, I don't know that I thought it was possible. Like when I was saying, "Hey guys, this is bullshit. Like this is messed up. Like look, we're employed by the major league team. Look at the owner's a billionaire. The teams are valued at, even back then, billions of dollars. Like there's no reason they can't pay us a living wage. I get we're minor leaguers. Nobody's sitting here saying this has to, we have to get rich or we have to make six figures even. But like 3 grand, 5 grand, like come on, like this is a joke, right? And there was just it was that one anecdote I gave you, that was pretty much uniform. That's where people were at then. Fast forward, you know, 6 or 7 years to 2020, I'm working at a law firm in Washington, DC, and this group Advocates for Minor Leaguers forms for the first time to try to do advocacy around the treatment of minor leaguers and improve things. And we could talk about that journey, but that led me to me leaving the law firm to go join this nonprofit. And it was really only at that point when I was working with other people who were just thinking, hey, how can we just make this situation better, plain and simple, that it became really clear that the only way to do that was going to be to form a union, that was the only way to create lasting sustained systemic change was to have a seat at the table through a union. The history of sports had shown that time and again that athletes, even at the major league levels, had only gotten treated the right way and and fairly after they unionized. So it really wasn't until years after my career ended that I really became such a believer that that was the only path forward for minor league players.
That's really brilliant. And so you initially had this realization. Did you talk to anybody about it? Did you sort of start organizing immediately? What was sort of your first step in terms of making that path a reality?
Yeah, so the way it had worked was a group of former players and a longtime labor leader and legend, really, who's a mutual friend of ours, Bill Fletcher, had formed Advocates for Minor Leaguers, and certainly they were pro-union in their philosophy and in their outlook about this. But I also think they were realistic that there's 6,000 minor league players across 150 teams across 38 states. Everyone's trying to make it to the major leagues. 90% won't. Um, Half the players, English wasn't their first language. So the obstacles to organizing were really, really, really significant. And it was kind of widely accepted in the baseball world that a union wasn't really even possible. So it was like, how can we do, pursue other strategies, whether they be legal or PR or whatever, to do something to improve the situation. Um, but then when I left the law firm and they hired me to be the first executive director of Advocates for Minor Leaguers, the first thing I did was sit down and try to put together a strategic plan. And any way you sliced it, just came back to like, yeah, we can do these things to sort of marginally improve things or chip away at it. Um, and that's not bad. I'm not saying we shouldn't think about that or try, but if our goal is really to do this, like, yeah, everyone says it's impossible, but you know how many times it's been tried? Zero. So why don't we at least try? And then if we can't, we can fall back on some of these other ways of maybe improving things. And obviously, like, Bill and others were all for it. There was no hesitation because these were, like I said, totally pro labor, pro union people. It was just a question of kind of the possibilities.
Awesome. And I did do an interview with Bill about his part of the story as well a while back. And it's time to dig that back up and we'll
Yeah,
bring that out as well to
absolutely.
dovetail with his story. Uh,
Absolutely.
let's talk about these working conditions because I mean, I've heard stuff. I think on one of your other interviews, people were sleeping on fans' couches and like sort of like relying on the kindness of other people. And, a lot of times people don't understand. It's not like they're saying to themselves, I'm gonna just do this part time. I feel like there's probably some people, some small number of people that have independent wealth and maybe they can just do this part time. But like you have to train like you're in the majors. You can't just
Right.
sort of half ass this. You got to really put the time in and practice. You don't have time to do a bunch of part time jobs and stuff to support yourself. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, 100%. And this was one of the big myths we had to kind of bust in our advocacy work and in our organizing, was that this wasn't a part-time job, a seasonal job, something that could be kind of done halfway. That if you wanted to become, you're already one of the 6,000 best baseball players in the world. If you want to be one of the best, 750 and make it to the major leagues, that's a full-time devotion, right? And so, when I started, it was like peanut butter and jelly and fast food for every meal. Sleeping three, four, five players on air mattresses in the same bedroom or with a host family. I mean, it was not unheard of literally for players to sleep in their car. It was crazy, right? Because, and you can just imagine, like, if you're making less than $10,000 a year, you just don't have any money. So like you just have to figure it out, right? And that's what the dynamic was. Um, and really, it's just not how human beings are supposed to live. It was also totally unnecessary, right? Like the teams clearly had the money as we moved over time to to make it better. It also just didn't, and this I think ended up helping us quite a bit in our advocacy work. It also just didn't make sense for the teams, right? Like we as the players, they wanted these players to get better and become major league players. And just like any employer should be investing in their workers and wanting the workers to be able to do the best they can. Like that was especially true in this industry where the workers really are the product and you're trying to make them high performers. So there were a whole lot of reasons that didn't make sense. But the reality is, like, sometimes in a capitalist system, people are going to pay as little as they can get away with, even if it doesn't make any sense. And that's really the dynamic up until we really got going with our work in advocates for minor leaguers around 2020, 2021. The minor leagues had been around over a century, and that's just how it was.
Did the players see themselves as workers, or did they see themselves as, people really passionate about this game and just whatever it takes, I'm going to get to the major leagues, or was there a balance of the two and other perspectives?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it changed over. This was my look. No, it's impossible to paint with a totally broad brush and say everyone's the same, but I think the general trajectory that I saw and talking to literally thousands of players over the years um, is people would come into the system and be pretty green and pretty happy to be there and lifelong dream. Been thinking about this since I was 10 years old on some level. Like, oh my God, putting on the uniform, I'm here, getting paid anything to play, you know, a sport. And then within 2, 3 years in the minor leagues of like living out what that actually meant and really being around it and actually showing up every day. And it is a job, and actually having an employer and being, um, sort of discarded and treated a certain way. I think the shine wore off. Didn't mean necessarily that people didn't still love the game or have an appreciation to be able to play baseball as opposed to other jobs, but people definitely once they've been there a few years were like, no, 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 this is a job. I'm a worker, and for the most part, I deserve fair treatment. And that was something that I saw take a few years generally to kind of set in for guys.
This is a sort of left field question, but what were the main concerns outside of pay that people were concerned with? Was it also the travel schedule, the number of games? We hear some of these things happening in the NFL these days about the number of games. They're fighting a lot about that. Were there any that you can remember that jump out at you?
Yeah, I mean, it was because the conditions were so poor and it was so, substandard in a day-to-day living, sort of perspective. That was most of the focus. So it was salaries, but it was also housing, it was meals. Um, it was literally like the stuff we take for granted or hope to be able to take for granted. But where am I sleeping tonight? What am I going to get to eat? Am I going to have any money at all to spend? Some players had families, wives, kids. Is there anything to support that? Those were the main things. Now there were other issues, and when we got eventually to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement, it certainly went beyond those core issues. But in terms of like the organizing, um, it really was hyper focused on very very baseline basic living and working conditions.
Another thing I remember from one of your interviews is that you did a lot of organizing on Instagram. Did I get that correct? That you were like DMing random
Yeah.
players. Like, what was the story
Yeah.
behind that? That's, I mean,
Y-
that's amazing. I know it's probably common for people now, but not back in the day.
yeah, it's funny. So that's exactly how it started. So really, once we kind of made the decision of, all right, we're gonna anything we do has to start with organizing the players, especially trying to form a union. um, the next question became, okay, we all have our small networks, but there's 6,000 of these guys, and a third of it, the minor leagues, turns over every year. So how are we going to actually, and they're all over the country, and we have a tiny budget. It's not like we have 200 organizers to go out to every team. So it's like, how are we going to do this? And so literally, we just pulled um, the Instagram handles of every single minor league player, and I would just sit there at night and copy and paste and just send I think sent out 4,500 or something like that, Instagram messages to different players, and you get ignored by most, right? Who are thinking like, who's this random guy in my DMs if they even read it, right? Um, but it was enough that you get however many hundreds to respond, and then from there move them to phone calls, and that was how we built the initial organizing committee was Instagram messages that we turned into phone calls, that we turned into our first Zoom call with, you know, less than 10 guys. And then from there, just, built and built and built and built, um, which we could talk about. But yeah, started all on Instagram.
That's legendary.
Bedroom, and it'd be like kind of a joke. And people would be like, what? It'd be like, no, no, and they'd be like, wait, we just were down. We just went to the game. Like there were like 8,000 fans there. Like, you know what I mean? Like they didn't get it. And we're like, yeah, it's just what it is.
They were paying you like you were a nonprofit employee, but you were working for a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. That's pretty
100%.
insane. I can't think of any other industry, and I talk to a lot of different folks who organize their industry, but I haven't really talked to very many folks with a similar level of imbalance where it's like that much money being made versus what's being paid to the players or workers.
Yep.
So it's a pretty unique story. Might likely have a conversation with DeMaurice Smith pretty soon about his new book. But that's a whole different thing because the football players, they're in a sort of different tier. The NFL players in a different tier in terms of how they get paid. But that actually leads me to my next question, which is why did you end up taking the players to the Major League Baseball Union as opposed to creating an independent entity, sort of, or its
Yeah.
own minor league baseball union for folks out there?
Yeah. It's a great question. And, I think I mean, first, for some sort of historical context, the MLBPA had been around for 60 years by the time we started this effort, had never attempted to organize the minor league players, right? Um, the current leadership of the MLBPA had been there, what, a decade, same thing, right? So, like, there wasn't any energy to do this coming from the MLBPA side or from the major league players. Um, but there were a couple reasons why we thought it was a good fit. One was, and this is probably the biggest one, that we knew it was going to be like we could create an organizing committee. I had a pretty good confidence once I started talking to players. Like we could get a couple hundred players to be engaged. But if we were going to get the rank and if we were actually going to try to unionize and get a majority and win an election or get voluntary recognition, we were going to need to have 3,000 plus like players actually sign union cards. And in order to do that, it was going to be very, very difficult, just given how much minor league players wanted to make it to the major leagues, to do that and to ask guys to risk, as you know, like there is risk that comes with organizing, right? To ask guys to risk their major league dreams to make their minor league situation better, we were going to be able to get some true believers to do that, but to get to like thousands of players to do that seemed very, very difficult unless we had the backing of the major league players because that's what these guys were aspiring to go be a part of, right? So that whole idea of like the whole goal of the minor leagues is to get to the major leagues was so baked in to the culture that we knew if we wanted to get kind of those um, those threes, those folks in the middle to jump in and come be a part of this, that push was probably going to come from being associated with major league players. And so really, the campaign to organize was really a two-part campaign. It was like the first part was we need to get the Major League Baseball Players Association to take in, the minor league players and to take on this effort. And then there was the campaign, with the employer and Major League Baseball, um, to get them to voluntarily recognize and negotiate a CBA. So it was interesting in that way because we very much thought about it that way. Like this is kind of, we're running kind of multiple campaigns at once, one at the MLBPA and one at Major League Baseball.
Wow. And you basically 6x their membership, right? If they were 750 players and
Yep.
you're bringing it to 5,000, you're having to explain to the major league players why they're suddenly going to get another, 5,000 fellow members. So how did that conversation go?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great question. So, look, there was a lot going on behind the scenes throughout this process, right? And it wasn't just, altruism or people say, hey, we're going to do this overnight. Like we needed to create pressure. And so a lot of that came from, we wanted to create a strong public narrative in favor of the minor leaguers that was going to kind of put pressure on both the MLBPA and MLB. And we did that throughout the 2021 season. You can go back and look. There was tons of articles about this housing situation that you and I were just talking about. Um, and it really succeeded in kind of putting pressure on both of those parties because from MLB's side, they just wanted the bad press to go away. They wanted us to go away. In any anti-union campaign, you have carrots and sticks, right? So their carrot was they gave us free housing at the end of the 2021 season, and that could have, potentially kind of dissipated the energy, right? And just been like, well, okay, we got what we were like asking for right now. We refused to let that happen. We kind of turned and took that win and used that as fuel for the organizing and said, okay, now look what we won with only several dozen players being organized. Imagine what we can do with thousands. And that was how we kind of supercharged the organizing. Um, but at the same time, the MLBPA was about to bargain its own major league contract. And they were really worried that the minor league campaign was outshining their issues, right? So they basically asked us to stand down. Like we had these wristbands that said fair ball, and we were using it to raise awareness for minor league players. We had minor league players wearing them, but then crucially, I was able to get some major league players to start wearing them. And then the broadcasts on like ESPN and stuff would start doing like things like, hey, David Price, Andrew McCutchen, these players are like wearing these wristbands. And the MLB really didn't like that because it was kind of distracting, right, from what they were trying to do in their contract. And so I basically was able to essentially extract a deal of we'll stand down during your contract if on the back end we have a real conversation about bringing the minor league players into the MLBPA. So that, that's how we were able to do it. And then, that off season, that's when we really, started to push the gas on the organizing. I hired an experienced organizer, a handful of former player organizers. We created an organizing committee that went to work organizing their teammates. And so like over the course of 6 months, we had more than 1,000 players signing petitions, taking action. So we went into that 2022 season really with the wind at our back. Um, and we had this PR campaign. We had the sort of good old fashioned grassroots organizing. We were also pursuing a really aggressive strategy on Capitol Hill because without going all the way down this side stream, baseball has an antitrust exemption that's unique, and that's part of what enabled the mistreatment of minor leaguers because it meant the teams could collude to pay, these ridiculously low wages. And so we were able to get bipartisan support for a re-examination of that exemption in the context of minor league working conditions. So in a matter of like 15 months, we had dialed this thing like all the way up. And some of this, you can appreciate this from your own experience, is like momentum is really big. So we like had a ton of momentum. And given the amount of turnover, as I said earlier, between minor league seasons, about a third of the workforce, we knew we kind of had it was faster than anybody would have guessed. It would have been even myself as kind of the leader of it, but we knew that was our moment to get the players unionized. Like we just had everything was coming together. Um, and so in July of 2022, we really had to ratchet up the final pressure on both of those parties, the PA and MLB. And we did it, really both at the All-Star game in Los Angeles. That Rob Manfred, the commissioner of Major League Baseball, was asked about the treatment of minor leaguers in his kind of annual All-Star game press conference. And he really put his foot in his mouth a bit and said, he told one of the reporters that, $8,000 a year actually is a living wage. And we immediately like took him to task for that, turned it into a national headline. It was the only, story coming out of the press conference was how out of touch this guy is. Um, within the same couple of weeks, he and I also had exchanged letters before the Senate Judiciary Committee in anticipation of a hearing about the antitrust exemption that was scheduled for September, where MLB would basically be taken to task for their mistreatment of minor leaguers. So you can imagine he was not excited about going to, be subjected to that testimony. Then at the same time, the MLB CBA was done and the MLBPA was still, dragging their feet. Predictably, I was told like, oh, actually, mañana, 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 right? Like, let's wait until the board meeting in December. We'll talk about it then, Harry. And finally, I just said like, in LA, we had a meeting. I said, no, enough is enough. Like, we're. I was just very direct. Like, we're going to make an attempt to unionize them this season, like with this group of players, because we've done math and like we have this 200-person committee. Like 60, 70 of these key leaders, they're going to be gone. That's just the math on this. We can't, we have the moment now to take our shot with or without you. And our analysis had always, there's a risk in that, but our analysis had always been that if the MLBPA was forced to that choice, this is happening with or without you, they would want it to be within their, within their union, within their control. And so they did. Um, and that was, I'm very glad that they did, because our analysis always was it was going to be much easier for it to succeed with them than trying to do it on our own. Um, I will say I was astonished when like I was in their office 48 hours before the cars were going to go out to bring the minor leaguers in. I realized that, to your initial question on this, the major league player reps didn't even know about this plan, right? Like the much less rank and file major leaguers, but they were going to add 6,000 members to a 1,200 person union with serious ramifications, constitutionally, structurally, et cetera, and completely change the, composition of the executive board. And a very, very small handful of players even knew that this was something that was even being talked about behind the scenes. So they were uh, really, I think, taken by surprise, um, about the whole thing. And I think, um, it was, look, candidly, I didn't represent the major leaguers, so it wasn't my problem, but I would have been uncomfortable with that, from a different seat for sure.
Candidly, what you did, you and the advocates minor leaguers did, is a sea change. It can't be understated how impactful it is on the industry, and for the people who cycle through the minor leaguers. And for folks in the audience who want to learn more about this, I'm going to be leaving some more sort of stories, interviews, and coverage that folks did on what Harry's work was at that
So
time, because I think it is worth reading into. If some of you will be watching this because you're trying to actively organize, and you can really take uh, some real inspiration from the marriage of not only the sports knowledge and expertise, but someone who comes from an industry, knows industry well, and then uses strategic organizing, which is Harry's story. And so, even if you're not a professional player, you should be inspired by this, because you can do this. Creating an organizing committee, getting union cards signed, and really, talking to everybody in your workplace is the only way that you can do this. And I'll be really frank about the fact that not enough unions in America even know how to do this anymore. And that is a big part of the reason why the labor movement has shrunk in the way that it has. A lot of what we like to do is sort of blame everybody else, legislation and politicians and whatever. But at the end of the day, if we organize, then you can make the impossible possible, which is what Harry is really talking about here. So thank you for sharing that
for
background.
sure.
So another thing I want to ask you is sports solidarity, which people can see in your background there. You've sort of taken what you started there and you made it into something much bigger and even, I guess, span across other sports. So can you talk a little bit about that? Why you started it, and what your goal is? Some success you've had there.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, I, as I kind of adverted to a few minutes ago, when we set up to do the minor league baseball effort, it was not something that I thought we're going to get from this to a union and a CBA in 2 years. But that's what happened, right? Because of the momentum and kind of how it played out. And so, I was sitting there and kind of right after getting the CBA negotiated in the spring of 2023, and there were some of these articles you just referenced were kind of going around, and so there was a fair bit of publicity around what we had done. And I started to get outreach just organically from other people from other sports, probably about a dozen different, groups, athletes, coaches, officials saying, "Hey, can you like this is really cool. Congrats. Can you help us do either can you personally help us do what you help them do, or can you just like give some, piece of advice, or can you point us in the direction of someone who can, or whatever, right? That kind of stuff." Um, And in that moment, I was so, and you can appreciate this when you're in a campaign, you're just like so laser focused on that, right? So like, especially for me, it was something I had lived. It was like kind of my people, minor league players. So I was just so, I wasn't thinking about anything outside of like minor league baseball players. How do we help them? Like, what can we do for the minor league players? Um, so as I thought about it, when I was getting this outreach, I realized that minor league baseball players were not alone, right? There were a lot of other folks across sports who really didn't have the resources to organize, or maybe had organized a tiny independent union on a shoestring budget based mostly on like the passion of like one or two people, but were really struggling to kind of, sustain it and keep up with the employer. Um, and one thing that's kind of unique, somewhat in sports is like unlike in other parts of the economy where there are unions that have organizing departments, regardless of how successful, there's a goal of like, here are people who are going to go out and add new members. You don't really have that at all in sports. So there's no like organizing departments in these sports unions. It's just not part of the culture. Most of these unions were formed a long time ago. And so I really had a vision of creating a new structure that could help all of these folks. I was like, well, if this many people are just reaching out to me, other people are reaching out to other people are not reaching out to anyone but are thinking it, other people out there need this but don't even know they need it. Like there's got to be a pretty big demand for this. And so started to just like do the analysis and realize, wow, there are tons of folks across sports, across job functions who are not organized. And I just looked around, I was like, nobody else is going to build something. There's just the existing structures, there just wasn't any like incentive and there wasn't anything set up to try to organize them. And so I said, well, what better time to try something like this than coming off a kind of a big win where everything went right, like the minor league organizing effort. Let's try to kind of replicate and scale what we did for the minor leaguers for all these other groups. And let's also learn from it and do some things differently, structurally and experiment. And so that's really the project of sports solidarity. And we've been off to a really good start that I'm proud of. I mean, we formally launched about 18 months ago. So far, we've helped three separate groups. So we helped the players of the United Football League, which is professional spring football. It was formed from the merger of the XFL and the USFL, about half former NFL players trying to get back to grow their union by about 10x in membership and a right to work state, negotiate a first CBA that won them significant pay increases and year-round healthcare. Then more recently this summer, we helped the players of Major League Pickleball and the PPA Tour to form the World Pickleball Players Association, which is the first ever players association in professional pickleball, which is like the fastest growing sport in the country. Um, and now we're, as we speak, helping the United States Rugby Players Association to negotiate a first contract for the players in Major League Rugby. So got some other campaigns in kind of early stages that, as you can appreciate, I don't want to blow up their spot on that. But look, we're learning a lot about what we want this to look like long term, but we're also delivering, I think, real time results here and now to help improve the lives of folks who would otherwise be left behind. So it's really gratifying. I'm always like so impressed by the leaders of these groups and the athletes and the people who, have, as you can appreciate, that's like the coolest thing about an organizing effort is the people and the people you meet and how inspiring they are and the commitment they have to bettering the situation for other folks who come after them and their coworkers. And so, look, it's really hard work. There's no kind of way around that, and we're definitely figuring it out as we go. But it's definitely energizing, and I'm excited that we've had the success and progress that we have had already in the first 18 months.
That's really commendable because you're helping more people change their lives. This is similar to the work we do with Union Base, where we're helping workers to figure out how to form their union and giving them just the basic advice. Because really, unionization is no longer common knowledge. It's something that's pretty rare for people to have the opportunity to unionize the workplace, even though it's the answer to so many people's problems. It's rare that people actually get the opportunity to do that. Um, and so, those industries that you mentioned, what are the biggest problems that you see facing people in rugby and pickleball? Is it sort of same lack of sustainable wages, or is it things that are people really don't think about?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a great question. And the one thing I've learned expanding beyond just baseball to these other sports is that there are similarities and differences in every group, right? So the core dynamic that's the same is the lack of voice for these workers and the idea that other people are dictating everything to them, right? Like that's the sort of the starting point. And that's very similar. And that's where organizing comes in, right? At the end of the day, it's about power and it's about taking back power and having collective power. And so that is always the same, right? So like the core dynamics, and I think that's why a lot of what we learned in baseball has proven transferable is because at the end of the day, it is fundamentally about organizing and about power. That said, the issues are different, right? I mean, in I'll take an example. In pickleball, they're actually paid pretty well. Certainly way better than minor league baseball players um, were. But there are plethora of sort of non-economic issues, scheduling issues. They get told you got to go be in this, other country or other state, next week, last minute. There's, tons of on court competition issues with the ranking system, issues with the prize money structure. So there's just it's a nascent sport. There's not a great infrastructure. There's a lot of like make it up as you go going on, and all of that's happening from the tour side, from the employer side. The athletes have no say. So they're getting paid okay, but their experience is one of kind of day-to-day powerlessness. In rugby or in the UFL, it's probably a little more like the minor league situation. Again, not quite as extreme of making less than $10,000 a year, but you know, really focused on um, making sure that those baseline working conditions are acceptable. At the same time, both of those sports are kind of startup leagues, and so trying to think through how do we grow and scale responsibly with the league, and really try to the best we can partner with the league early on to say this startup league is only going to succeed if everyone's on the same page. The players got to be bought in, ownership has to be bought in. If like we don't have the luxury, candidly, of some adversarial hostile relationship like you can have in Major League Baseball when it's super mature, the NFL where it's super mature, super profitable, and people will sit around and withstand that. Um, we just that's not the case for like Major League Rugby or the UFL. And so you learn, you adapt and you try to help meet these folks where they are and provide whatever expertise we can. But in each case, there are current and recently former athletes who are really spearheading it and um, who are tremendous, just as there were, tons of current players in the minor leagues who really took on risk. And just can't say enough about those folks. And if I can create a structure and our team can create a structure and provide some expertise that allows them to tap in to that, um, that's really what we're trying to do at the end of the day.
It's going to be very interesting to see how you are able to impact these various sports industries with the contracts that you settle and the new agreements that you create, because these are industries that have never had collective bargaining agreements before, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, in so right now, the rugby one is the third, initial slash first CBA that, I'll have been the lead negotiator for in 3 years. And so anytime you're doing a first CBA, as you know, it's just, it's very different than a subsequent CBA where you're making adjustments off of something that already exists. You're really, you're baking the cake from scratch. And so, especially when you're looking at like startup leagues, we want to be as creative as we can to make sure that we're getting the best possible outcome we can for the athletes, both short, medium, and long term. And so it's interesting, and I do think there's always challenges, but I think there's also a ton of upside when you're dealing with things for the first time.
Yeah, and we don't hear much about this on like ESPN. We might see something go across the ticker or a small article, but how are you getting the word out about these things? Because it's really, I think people are very, very interested to hear more about it. If they want to know what's happening with Sports Solidarity and the victories you guys have, where should they go?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, certainly at sportssolidarity.org. And, I mentioned this to you recently, Larry, but I'm about to start a podcast of my own actually later this year, which I'm excited about, in part because of what you just said, which is, we do want to get these stories out there. We do think people are interested in them. You know, we kind of occupy this interesting spot at the intersection of sports and labor. And there's, we're very fortunate to just have relationships with a lot of really interesting people with experiences at that intersection. And getting those stories out there, I think um, is incredibly important. Something that we've been able to do from time to time, but not in necessarily like a systematic way, more when like there's been a flare up around a dispute or, an issue. And we're hoping that this podcast will be, one way of kind of getting the word out there more systematically, which we're excited about.
Speaking of the news, there was a recent story about a league called the Independent Pioneer League, and I understand that they play baseball and that they will be getting managed at least for one game by AI, which kind of blew my mind. It's like, why would you give away your management responsibility to an AI? I understand that's sort of the hot thing now, but I was curious, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know how informed they are, but I can definitely give you my thoughts. I think, so first, the Pioneer League is one of a handful of what are now called, I think, MLB partner leagues. These are basically minor leagues that are not affiliated with a major league team. So kind of a rung below or outside of the affiliated minor league system that we organized a few years ago. Um, and, on the one hand, I kind of understand why this would happen in a place like the Pioneer League, right? Minor league baseball, it's kind of known for its gimmicks, right? That's, to be fair, kind of part of the charm, right? Of minor league baseball. It's 150 games or whatever. Like you're always looking for something to engage the fans and bring people out and sell tickets. And I don't think the world is going to end because they, have an AI manager, or that suddenly like AI is going to replace managers more generally. Um, but I will say again, this is just sort of my perspective, um, with the caveat that I know how excited a lot of people are about AI, and there's no doubt it will, unlock amazing things, in various ways. Um, I try to think about things kind of from first principles wherever I can, and I think we need to be thinking like, what's the point of all of this, right? And we've seen versions of this debate in sports for years, like in baseball there's been a debate about the pros and cons of having data and analytics drive so much in-game decision making for baseball teams probably since Moneyball for like a quarter century, right? And my view has always been like, look, it makes total sense that a team that's trying to maximize wins is going to look for every advantage and they're going to lean on anything they can. But that doesn't mean the system or like the game is going to be better for it, right? And I think, human beings are flawed. We make mistakes. I personally believe that and I can speak from my own experience, like I enjoy watching sports and I love sports so much in part for the human drama. And that includes mistakes, right? Both physical and mental, as well as successes and the contrast between them, right? And I think anything that is less human to me is less entertaining, right? And to me, like the point of sports is that human drama, is to be entertaining. So I think, you know, changes that are not directed at, I don't understand it, the sport to be a human drama and are not trying to entertain, I think I'm skeptical of. And I think, I'm just generally wary probably of AI, maybe more than the next person off the street. So maybe that informs some of this. But I definitely met that news with a bit of a raised eyebrow. Um, and I don't know where others are at on it.
I think you have company in your skepticism more than you realize. I think there's a really infectious tone to what you said about the human element. and this is a recurring theme on this channel, that anywhere we introduce AI, we are losing something, just a little something. And so, we'll have to follow with you, and either getting something, either another interview or something written from you about it, and see how it goes and if it becomes a larger trend. But this has been a really fantastic conversation, Harry, and we really appreciate you joining us. I want you to give us the last word. You shared about your story of organizing, your career, changing people's lives across sports. What do you want to leave with our audience today?
No, man, I just want to say thank you, honestly, for what you do, for the great work you've done. It's been great to, form a friendship with you. Appreciate you having me on here to have this conversation. I have no doubt we'll continue to have, great conversations off camera and offline as well about all these things. But yeah, just want to say thanks, and it's an honor to be here on the channel with you and chat with you for a little bit.
Awesome.